Some ships sail on water. Others sail on fear. The Carnage was a vessel of the latter sort. Carved from the bones of its victims and stained with the sins of its crew, it was less a ship and more a floating piece of hell, captained by a devil named Vargas. To the world, Captain Iron Fist, Vargas was a brute and a butcher, but to the souls trapped aboard his ship, he was something far worse. He was their god, a cruel god who delighted in the small, everyday torments of his creations. And in this floating hell, Lina was a ghost. She had been captured months ago, a prize from a raided merchant ship. Her old life burned away with the sails of her vessel. Now she was the cleaner, a creature of the shadows, her survival dependent on a simple, desperate art form, invisibility. She learned the ship's rhythms, the patterns of its predators. She knew which floorboards creaked, which shadows were deepest, and which members of the crew were best to be avoided entirely. She moved through the filth and the squalor with her head down and her mouth shut, her presence as insignificant as the bilge rats that scurried alongside her in the dark. To be noticed by Vargas or his men was to become a toy, and toys on the Carnage were always broken. Her world was a map of misery, but its darkest territory, its heart of absolute despair, was the brig. The ship's hold, a place of perpetual darkness, rank with the smell of salt water, rot, and something else, a metallic tang of old blood and forgotten suffering. This was Vargas's trophy room, and in its deepest cell, he kept his greatest prize. He was a secret, a legend whispered among the crew in hushed, terrified tones. They called him the Cursed One, the Beast in the Bilge. He had been captured in a legendary battle, a clash of pirate titans that had left the sea red for a league. Vargas had won, but not before the prisoner had laid a curse upon him and his ship. Or so the story went. No one knew his real name. No one saw his face. Vargas kept him chained in the suffocating blackness, a living symbol of his victory, a monster to scare new recruits. The crew was forbidden from going near the cell. They believed the curse was real, a sickness of the skin and soul that could spread through the very air. They said his skin was like cracked stone, his eyes like dying embers, a monstrous form forced upon him by the light. And so, he was left to rot in the dark. Lina's job was to clean the passage outside the brig. Every day she would scrub the damp, slimy wood, her ears filled with the terrified silence that emanated from the final cell. She tried not to think about the man inside. She tried to believe the stories. It was safer that way. But one night, her world tilted on its axis. As she worked, a tremor of pain, a low, guttural groan escaped the cell. It wasn't the sound of a monster. It was the sound of a man in agony. It was a sound she understood all too well. Something inside her, some deeply buried ember of compassion that had survived the freezing darkness of her new life, stirred. The rule of survival was simple. Do not get involved. Do not be seen. But the groan came again, weaker this time, followed by the dry, rasping sound of someone struggling to breathe. She found herself on her feet, her own rules shattering around her. She looked down the dark passage. No one was there. The guards, too afraid of the curse, never patrolled this deep. She was alone with the ghost. Trembling, she took the small, hard biscuit she had saved for her own meal and the waterskin at her hip. And she broke the first and most important rule of the Carnage. She walked towards the cell. The darkness was absolute. The stench of decay and sickness was overwhelming. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice a tiny, fragile thing in the oppressive silence. There was no answer. She knelt, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could just make out the shape of the bars, thick and rusted. I have water," she said, her voice trembling. A slow, rasping sound came from the darkness within, the clink of a chain. And then, a hand emerged from the shadows, reaching towards the bars. Lina recoiled in shock. The stories were true. The skin was a horrifying sight, gray and deeply fissured, like drought-stricken earth. It was the hand of a golem, a creature of stone. But as it reached the thin beam of light from her distant lantern, she saw the tremor in its fingers. The weakness. This wasn't a monster's hand. It was the hand of a man who was dying. Her fear was eclipsed by a wave of pity so profound it stole her breath. She pushed the waterskin through the bars, her own fingers brushing against the cold, stone-like skin. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. The hand flinched, then closed around the waterskin with a desperate strength. She heard the sound of frantic, grateful drinking. Then she pushed the biscuit through. The hand took that too, more gently this time. A voice, cracked and raw from disuse, rasped from the darkness. Why? Lina didn't have an answer. Because no one should die alone in the dark, she whispered back. And so began their secret. Every night, Lina would steal a portion of her own meager food, a little extra water, and sometimes a piece of clean cloth to dress wounds she could not see. She would bring them to the dark cell. She became the ghost's ghost, his only connection to the world of the living. They rarely spoke. Their communion was in the silent offering and the grateful acceptance. In the darkness, he was not the cursed beast of the crew's nightmares. He was just a voice, a presence, a soul as trapped as her own. She would tell him about the sky, about the stars she could sometimes see through the grime of the deck, describing the colors of the sunset to a man who lived in perpetual night. He, in turn, would listen, his silent attention a strange and profound comfort. She was cleaning his cell, but in a way, he was cleaning her soul, reminding her of a part of herself she thought had died. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his crime. And she had no idea of the power that lay dormant within him. She didn't know that the food she brought was fuel, that the water was sustenance, that her simple, human kindness was something far more powerful. It was an antidote, unseen by her. In the weeks that followed, a slow miracle was taking place in the darkness. The stone-like skin, a result of a poison Vargas had used on him, a poison that reacted tortuously with light, was beginning to heal. Her touch, her compassion, and the simple nourishment were fighting the poison in a way his own formidable strength could not. The cracks were slowly sealing. The man was returning. The king was waking up. Lina saw only the man she was saving. She never saw the legend she was resurrecting. She had no idea that her small acts of rebellion, of quiet humanity in a world devoid of it, were not just saving a life. They were sharpening a weapon. A weapon that, when finally unleashed, would bring down Captain Vargas and his entire reign of terror. She was just the poor cleaner feeding the cursed prisoner in the hold. She had no way of knowing that she was, in fact, feeding the hope, the fury, and the inevitable vengeance of Kaelan, the dragon of the sea, the one true pirate king. The secret became Lina's anchor in the churning sea of her existence. The nightly ritual was the only part of her day that felt real, the only time she was not a ghost but a person performing an act of deliberate choice. Her fear of being discovered was a constant, gnawing thing, but it was overshadowed by the strange, protective bond she had formed with the man in the dark. She started taking greater risks. She stole a tinderbox and a stub of a candle, and for a few precious minutes each night, she would light it, pushing it just inside the bars. It was in that first flicker of candlelight that she saw him. Not the monster, but the ruins of a man. His face was gaunt, framed by a matted tangle of long, dark hair. A thick, rusted iron collar was bolted around his neck, a chain leading back into the darkness. But it was his eyes that captured her. They were the color of a stormy sea, and in their depths, she saw not monstrousness, but a profound and ancient weariness, an intelligence that burned brighter than the candle flame, and a flicker of something she had never expected: gratitude. He flinched from the light, his skin still a painful-looking mosaic of gray, cracked tissue, but he didn't retreat. He endured it, as if her small light was a sun he was willing to be burned by. "You should not do this," he rasped one night, his voice slowly gaining strength. "Vargas will kill you if he finds out. Wolf, if he finds out. Vargas will kill you if he finds out. Vargas will kill you if he finds out. Vargas will kill you if he finds out. If he finds out. Zo companhia. If he finds out, he will kill me eventually anyway," Lina replied softly, her voice filled with a fatalism that was common on the carnage. "At least this way, my life will have meant something." His stormy eyes studied her for a long moment. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lina." "Lina," he repeated, the name tasting strange and foreign on his tongue. "My name is Kaelan." It was the first piece of himself he had given her, and she treasured it like a jewel. Kaelan. The name held a weight, a power that seemed at odds with the broken man before her. She didn't know how right she was. While their secret world unfolded in the hold, the world on the deck above was growing more tense. Captain Vargas was a man who thrived on misery, and the relative quiet on his ship was beginning to bore him. He needed a spectacle, and he decided his cursed trophy in the brig would provide the entertainment. He announced to the crew that in 3 days, he would be hosting a celebration. He would drag the beast from the hold and display him on deck, proving once and for all the dominance of Iron Fist Vargas over all his enemies. The news spread through the ship like a plague. The crew was terrified. They believed the curse would be unleashed upon them all if the monster was brought into the light. For Lina, the news was a death sentence. Not for herself, but for Kaelan. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that he would not survive it. The light was poison to him. Vargas knew this. This wasn't a celebration. It was a public execution disguised as a party. That night, she went to his cell, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She told him what Vargas was planning. In the candlelight, she saw his jaw tighten, a flash of pure, unadulterated fury briefly illuminating his storm-gray eyes. The weary prisoner vanished, and for a terrifying second, she saw a king. "He will not win, Lina," Kaelan vowed, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the iron bars. "His pride will be his undoing." "But how?" she whispered desperately. "You are chained? You are weak?" He looked at her, his expression softening. "I am not as weak as I was," he said. "Thanks to you." He then told her what he needed. It was a simple request, but an impossible one. He needed a key. Not the key to his shackles. That was a massive custom-made thing that Vargas wore around his neck. He needed the key to the brig's main passage door, a smaller, simpler key kept on a hook in the quartermaster's office. "Get me that key," he said, "and I promise you, this ship will be ours before the sun rises." It was madness, a desperate gamble. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw not insanity, but a cold, hard certainty. For the first time since her capture, a spark of hope ignited within her. A dangerous, terrifying hope. She agreed. The next 2 days were a blur of calculated terror. Lina, the invisible cleaner, began to watch the quartermaster, a fat, lazy man named Stitch. She studied his routine, the way he left his office unlocked when he went for his nightly rum, the way he always hung the ring of keys on the same hook by the door. She knew that getting the key was only half the battle. She had to return it before Stitch noticed it was gone. On the final night, the night before the celebration, the ship was alive with a nervous, drunken energy. Vargas had ordered double rations of rum for all hands, wanting his audience to be well lubricated for the morning's spectacle. This was her chance. With her heart pounding so hard she thought it would break through her ribs, Lina slipped into the quartermaster's office while Stitch was on deck. Her hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the ring of keys. She found the small, iron key for the brig. Taking a piece of soap she had saved, she pressed the key into it, creating a perfect mold. Then, with painstaking care, she used a small, stolen file to begin shaping a piece of scrap metal she had found into a crude copy. It was a slow, agonizing process. The sound of every drunken shout from the deck made her jump. But as the hours passed, a rough, but functional, key began to take shape. It was a testament to the resilience she had learned, the quiet observation that had been her only shield. As she worked, Kaelan was doing the same in the darkness of his cell. The strength she had given him was returning, slowly but surely. He began to test his chains, not with brute force, but with patience, finding the weakest link, the one that had rusted more than the others. He used a small stone he had chipped from the floor to slowly, methodically grind at the metal, the sound masked by the revelry above. They were two prisoners, separated by wood and iron, working in silent concert towards a single, explosive purpose. Just before dawn, as the first gray light began to bleed into the sky, Lina's key was finished. With trembling hands, she slipped back to the quartermaster's office, returned the original, and crept down into the hold. The ship was quiet now. The drunken crew passed out on the deck. She slid the crude key into the lock of the main passage door. It stuck. Her blood ran cold. It didn't work. Panic seized her. But then she remembered Kaelan's voice, calm and certain in the dark. She took a breath, jiggled the key gently, and with a soft, beautiful click, the lock turned. She raced to his cell. "I did it," she whispered, her voice a mix of triumph and terror. She passed him the key. "You have done more than you know, Lina," he rasped from the darkness. "Now, go, hide, and no matter what you hear, do not come out until you hear my voice call your name."
Shimero Naroi, Shimero.
Do not come out until you hear my voice call your name." She hesitated, not wanting to leave him. "Kaelan. Kaelan. 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 Go," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Lina retreated, her heart torn. She hid in the deepest, darkest corner of the cargo hold, burying herself under a pile of old sails, and she waited. The sun rose, and with it came the sound of Vargas and his men, their heavy boots echoing on the steps as they descended into the hold, ready for their show. She heard them laughing and joking. She heard them arrive at the main passage door, the one she had just unlocked. And then she heard the silence, the confused murmurings, the sudden sharp cry of alarm, and then the explosion of violence. The sounds that followed were the sounds of nightmares. The roar that erupted from Kaelan's cell was not human. It was the sound of a force of nature unleashed, the sound of a dragon waking from a long, cursed sleep. The screams of Vargas's men were short and sharp. Lina pressed her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face, trembling in the dark. She had not just freed a man, she had unleashed a reckoning. The king was free, and he was cleansing his kingdom with fire and blood. Lina, hidden in the suffocating darkness of the cargo hold, experienced the battle not through sight, but through sound, and the sounds were primal. The deep, guttural roar of Kaelan was the bass note in a symphony of terror. It was answered by the high-pitched screams of men, sounds of disbelief turning into agony. She heard the sickening crunch of bone, the wet, tearing sound of violence that needed no weapon but pure, unrestrained strength. The heavy iron door of the cell, which took 4 men to move, was ripped from its hinges with a shriek of tortured metal. The very timbers of the ship seemed to groan in protest. This was not a fight. It was a harvest. Captain Vargas's laughter had turned into enraged, disbelieving shouts. "He's just one man. Kill him. Kill the beast." But his men were no longer soldiers. They were prey. They had come down into the dark to poke a chained animal, and had found themselves locked in a cage with a god of vengeance. The sounds of the slaughter moved upwards, out of the brig and onto the lower decks. The element of surprise was total. The main crew, groggy and hungover from the night's revelry, woke not to a celebration, but to the sounds of their shipmates being torn apart below. Panic, the most corrosive of acids on a pirate ship, began to eat through the command structure. Men stumbled for weapons, shouting in confusion, their drunken courage evaporating in the face of an unseen, unstoppable terror. Lina remained huddled under the sails, every muscle in her body screaming for her to run, to flee. But Kaelan's final command, "Wait until you hear my voice," was an anchor in the storm of her fear. She had placed her faith in the man in the dark, and all she could do now was pray that he was not a monster who would forget the ghost who had set him free. On the main deck, the sun had fully risen, casting a brilliant, unforgiving light, and into this light, Kaelan emerged. He was a vision from a nightmare. His chains, shattered through sheer force, still hung from the iron collar around his neck, and from one wrist, whipping around him like metallic tentacles. His body, though still gaunt, was a terrifying landscape of coiled muscle and raw power. And the curse, the light struck his skin, and it began to crack and fissure, smoke rising from the painful-looking wounds. But he did not flinch. He did not cry out. He embraced the agony, wearing it like a crown. He was a being of pure, incandescent rage, his storm-gray eyes burning with a light that was far more terrifying than the sun. The crew on deck froze, their blood turning to ice water in their veins. The beast from their legends was real, and he was free. Captain Vargas was the last to emerge from the hatch, his face pale, his bravado shattered. He saw the looks on his crew's faces. He saw the fear, and he knew in that moment that he had lost control. He had built his kingdom on fear, but the creature standing before them was fear made flesh. "Kaelan," Vargas spat, trying to reclaim his authority. "I should have killed you when I had the chance." Kaelan took a slow, deliberate step forward, the broken chain on his wrist dragging across the deck to sound like a serpent's hiss. "You had your chance, Vargas." His voice was no longer a rasp, but a low, resonant growl that promised death. "You left me in the dark to rot. You did not know that darkness is my kingdom. You are just a tourist here." With another roar, he charged. The remaining crew, loyal to Vargas through greed or stupidity, moved to intercept him. It was a slaughter. Kaelan moved with a brutal, terrifying grace. He was not just strong. He was a master combatant. He used the broken chains as whips, shattering bones and skulls. He fought not like a man, but like an idea. The idea that a soul, pushed too far into the darkness, will eventually become the darkness itself. Vargas, a coward at his core, did not join the fight. He used the chaos to retreat, backing away towards the stern, his eyes darting towards the ship's longboat, his only path of escape. The battle for the deck lasted less than 5 minutes. When it was over, Kaelan stood amidst the wreckage of Vargas's command, his chest heaving, his cursed skin smoking under the sun. The surviving crew members had thrown down their weapons, their faces a mixture of terror and a strange, primal awe. They were pirates. They did not follow men, they followed power. And the power on this ship had just changed hands in the most definitive way possible. Kaelan stood there for a long moment, the agony of the sunlight a visible torment. He was the king, but he was still a prisoner of his curse. He needed the darkness. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the carnage, and then he looked down towards the cargo hold. His expression, for the first time, softened from pure rage into something else, concern. He took a deep breath, ignoring the searing pain of his skin, and he called out, his voice echoing across the now silent ship. Lina! Down in the darkness, buried under the sails, Lina heard her name. It was the voice of the man she had saved, the king she had unleashed. The storm was over. Uncurling her stiff limbs, she crawled out from her hiding place. She was covered in dust and grime, her face pale, but her eyes were clear. She walked out of the hold and onto the blood-soaked deck, blinking in the bright sunlight. She saw the bodies. She saw the terrified crew, now kneeling in submission. And then she saw him, Kaelan, standing in the center of it all. Standing in the center of it all. He was more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. A wounded, cursed god of war. And he was looking at her. All the noise, all the violence faded away. In that moment, there were only the two of them, the cleaner and the king. He took a step towards her, and the crew flinched as one. But his movements were slow, deliberate. The agony of the sunlight was clearly immense. He stopped a few feet from her, his stormy eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice now gentle, a shocking contrast to the carnage around them. Lina could only nod, words failing her. He looked at the iron collar still bolted around his neck. "There is one last piece of business," he growled, his eyes finding Vargas, who was trying to sneak away to the longboat. With a speed that defied his injuries, Kaelan crossed the deck and seized Vargas by the throat, lifting him off his feet. "The key!" Kaelan snarled, his face inches from the terrified captain's. With trembling hands, Vargas unhooked the large, ornate key from his neck. Kaelan snatched it, unlocked the collar, and threw the heavy iron ring to the deck with a clang of finality. Then he turned his attention back to Vargas. "You took my ship. You cursed my body. You left me to die," Kaelan said, his voice dangerously soft. "But your greatest crime was hurting the only person on this ship with a shred of decency in her soul." His eyes flickered towards Lina. "For that, there is no quick death." "There is no quick death." He didn't kill Vargas. He did something far worse. He declared him the new cleaner, the new ghost. Condemned to scrub the decks of the ship he once commanded, under the watchful eyes of the crew, who now served a new, and far more terrifying, master. It was a fate worse than death, a humiliation that would follow him for the rest of his days. With his justice delivered, Kaelan turned his back on his broken enemy. His gaze fell upon Lina once more. The adrenaline was fading, and the full agony of the sun's curse was returning. He swayed on his feet, his strength finally beginning to fail. "Take me below," he rasped, his voice a plea. "Take me back to the dark." "Hey, Riga." Without hesitation, Lina moved to his side. She, the small, insignificant cleaner, put her arm around the waist of the fearsome pirate king, and she guided him, step by agonizing step, away from the light, away from the deck, and back down into the shadows of the ship that was now, against all odds, his kingdom had been reclaimed. But his battle, and hers, was far from over. Leading Kaelan back down into the familiar gloom of the ship's interior was a surreal experience. Just hours ago, she had been the one sneaking through these passages in fear. Now, the crew, her former tormentors, practically threw themselves against the walls to get out of her way. They didn't look at her with contempt anymore. They looked at her with a terrified awe. She wasn't just the cleaner. She was the king's hand, the ghost who had walked into the monster's cage and emerged with him on a leash. They didn't understand what she was to him, but they understood that her proximity to power was a power all its own. She took him not to his old cell, but to the captain's quarters, Vargas's opulent, gaudy cabin. It was a place Lina had only ever scrubbed the floors of, her head bowed. Now, she kicked the door open and guided the most dangerous man on the seas to the large, feathered bed as if he were a sick child. The moment the shadows of the cabin enveloped him, Kaelan let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. The searing agony of his skin began to subside, though the deep, angry cracks remained. He collapsed onto the bed, the full weight of his ordeal, his escape, and his victory, finally crashing down upon him. For the first time, Lina got a true look at him without iron bars between them. The curse or poison was a horrific thing. His skin was not just cracked. It seemed to carry a memory of pain, a roadmap of his suffering. But beneath it, she could see the man he was supposed to be. The strong line of his jaw, the noble structure of his face, the sheer, undeniable presence of a man born to command. He was a fallen king, trapped within the prison of his own skin. "The crew will need orders," he rasped, his eyes closed. "They are leaderless, frightened. They will turn on each other or on us." "What should I tell them?" Lina asked, her voice small in the grand cabin. What should I small in the grand cabin? He opened his eyes, the storm-gray irises locking onto hers. "You will tell them nothing," he said. "You will show them." He gestured with his head towards a large sea chest in the corner. "In there, my personal effects. Vargas kept them as trophies. There is a small, leather-bound book." Lina found the chest and opened it. Inside, amongst fine clothes and navigational tools, was the book. It was a logbook filled with Kaelan's sharp, precise handwriting. It detailed the locations of his hidden caches, the names of his allies, the complex network of his pirate empire. It was the key to his kingdom. "Take it to the first mate," Kaelan commanded. "A man named Gregor. He is scarred, has one eye, but he is loyal. He was my man before he was Vargas's. Tell him to set a course for the Isle of Whispers. Tell him the dragon has returned." Handing over the book was a test. It was an act of supreme trust. He was placing the entire infrastructure of his power into her hands, trusting that she, a stranger, a captive, would deliver it to the right person. She didn't hesitate. She took the book and walked back out onto the deck. Finding Gregor was easy. He was the one trying to instill some semblance of order in the chaos. When Lina approached him, the one-eyed pirate tensed, his hand going to his sword. Lina simply held out the book. "A message from the captain," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He says to set a course for the Isle of Whispers. He says the dragon has returned." He said. Gregor's one good eye widened. He stared at her, then at the book. He took it, his rough fingers tracing the familiar emblem of a dragon embossed on the cover. He opened it, recognized the handwriting, and a slow, fierce grin spread across his scarred face. "Aye," he boomed, his voice carrying across the deck. "Aye, that I will." He turned to the crew. "You heard the lady. She speaks with the king's voice. Set the sails. We're going home." A ragged cheer went up from the crew. It wasn't a cheer of joy, but of relief. They had a purpose again, a direction, a king. And the king had a herald, Lina. When she returned to the cabin, Kaelan was asleep. It was the first true sleep he had likely had in months, the sleep of a man who was no longer caged. Lina watched him for a long moment. This terrifying, powerful man was, in this moment, utterly vulnerable, dependent on her. She found a bowl and some fresh water and, tearing a strip from one of Vargas's fine silk shirts, she began to clean his wounds. She started with the cuts from the battle, but then her hands moved to his skin. The cursed, cracked flesh. As she gently dabbed the cool water on his forehead, something strange happened. A faint, golden light, no brighter than a firefly, seemed to emanate from her fingertips. Where her touch lingered, the deep cracks in his skin seemed to soften, the angry red receding slightly. She pulled her hand back, startled. What was that? She tried again on his arm. The same thing happened. A soft, warm, golden glow. The healing was almost imperceptible, but it was there. She didn't understand it. Was it magic? Was she a witch, as the crew had whispered? Or was it something else? A connection forged in the dark? An empathy so profound it could manifest as a physical force? She realized that her kindness hadn't just been feeding his body. It had been healing his soul, and that healing was now reflecting on his physical form. The curse wasn't just a poison, it was despair, made manifest, and she was the antidote. For days, as the carnage sailed towards the Isle of Whispers, a new routine formed. By day, Lina was Kaelan's voice on the ship. She relayed his orders to Gregor, managed the ship's stores, and brought a quiet, steadying presence to the volatile crew. They began to call her the Queen of Shadows, a title spoken with a new respect. She was the only one who could enter the captain's darkened cabin and emerge unscathed. By night, she was his healer. She would sit by his bed, tending to his skin with her strange, gentle light. They would talk for hours. He told her of his life before Vargas. He was not just a pirate, he was the leader of a vast coalition of free captains, a man who had tried to bring a code of honor to the lawless seas. He told her how Vargas, his trusted second-in-command, had betrayed him, poisoning him, and selling him out to the Navy, only to liberate him and claim his ship and title in a twisted act of treachery. She, in turn, told him of her own simple life, of her family lost to sickness, of her dreams of one day owning a small bakery by the sea. Simple dreams from a world away. In that dark cabin, they were not the pirate king and the cleaner. They were Kaelan and Lina. Two survivors, their scars, both visible and invisible, finding a strange comfort in each other's presence. But their fragile peace was not destined to last. As they neared the Isle of Whispers, Kaelan's strength returned. The cracks on his skin had faded into a network of fine, silver lines, a permanent reminder of his ordeal. He was able to stand in dim light now, his power returning with every passing hour. He was becoming the king again, and with that power came the burden of his old life. One evening, Gregor came to the cabin. He bowed to Lina, then turned to Kaelan. "Captain," he said, his voice grave. "A raven arrived from the coalition. They know of your return, but things have changed. In your absence, a new power has risen. A pirate queen named Seraphina. She has united the southern fleets, and she is not happy that the dragon has returned from the dead." Kaelan stood, his shadow looming large in the lantern light. The weary prisoner was gone. The dragon was fully awake now. Seraphina, he mused, a dangerous glint in his eye. She was always ambitious. He looked at Gregor. "Send a raven back. Tell the coalition I will meet them. Tell them to be ready for a war." Lina watched this exchange, a cold dread seeping into her heart. The man she had healed, the man she had shared stories with in the dark, was disappearing. In his place was a king, a strategist, a warrior preparing for battle. She had saved him, nursed him back to health, only to deliver him back to the world of violence and death that had nearly destroyed him. She had freed him from one cage, but was he now simply walking into another, larger one? And she wondered, with a growing sense of fear, where a simple cleaner with healing hands fit into the world of a pirate king about to go to war. The Isle of Whispers was not a place found on any imperial map. It was a pirate sanctuary, a jagged fortress of volcanic rock and dense jungle, its harbor hidden from the open sea by a maze of treacherous reefs that only the most skilled captains could navigate. It was Kaelan's home, his capital, the heart of the empire he had built. As the carnage slipped through the secret passage into the grand harbor, a cheer went up from the assembled ships. The news had spread. The dragon had returned. But as they drew closer to the docks, Lina saw that the welcome was not as unified as it sounded. Among the cheering crews, she saw other faces. Hard, watchful faces, standing under banners she did not recognize, banners bearing the sigil of a silver kraken. Seraphina's fleet. They were not here to celebrate. They were here to measure a rival. Kaelan stood on the prow of his ship, no longer hiding in the shadows. He had donned the clothes from his sea chest, a long coat of dark, supple leather, boots of high quality, his dark hair tied back. The fine silver scars on his skin were still visible in the daylight, a testament to his ordeal, but they no longer seemed like a curse. They looked like the markings of a legend, a man who had literally walked through hell and returned. He was every inch the king. When he stepped onto the dock, the cheering faltered, replaced by an awed, uncertain silence. The man they remembered was powerful, but this man was different. He was harder, colder, his eyes holding the ancient darkness of the brig. He had been remade. At the head of the assembled captains stood Gregor, and beside him a woman. She was tall, with hair the color of molten copper braided with silver rings, and eyes as green and sharp as broken glass. She wore trousers and a captain's coat with an easy confidence that radiated pure, undiluted authority. This was Serafina, the pirate queen. "Kaelan," she said, her voice a silken purr that held the sharp edge of a razor. "The rumors of your death, it seems, were greatly exaggerated." "You sound disappointed, Serafina," Kaelan replied, his voice a low rumble. "Nearly surprised," she countered, her green eyes flicking past him, landing on Lina, who stood hesitantly at the top of the gangplank. Serafina's eyes narrowed, taking in Lina's simple cleaner's clothes, her quiet demeanor. A slow, mocking smile spread across her face. "I see you brought back a stray. Does the great dragon of the sea now collect broken birds?" "Look." Before Kaelan could respond, Lina walked down the gangplank. All eyes were on her. She felt 1,000 times more exposed than she had on the deck of the Carnage, but the fear she had lived with for so long had been burned away. She stopped beside Kaelan, meeting Serafina's condescending gaze without flinching. "My name is Lina," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "and I am no one's stray." Serafina's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of surprise. She had expected a timid servant, not this quiet defiance. Kaelan looked down at Lina, a flicker of pride in his stormy eyes. The balance of power on the island had just been drawn, and it was not just between two pirate lords. It was between two queens. The days that followed were a cold war, fought in the taverns and council halls of the pirate sanctuary. Serafina's influence, established in Kaelan's absence, was strong. She argued that Kaelan was a ghost, a legend whose time had passed. She offered the coalition a future of organized raids, of wealth, of power consolidated under her single, undisputed command. Kaelan, she argued, offered only a return to the old ways, a quest for vengeance against Vargas that would bring the full wrath of the Imperial Navy down upon them. Many of the newer captains, who had never served under Kaelan, were swayed by her logic. Lina found herself in a world she could not comprehend. She was given lavish quarters in Kaelan's fortress, but she was an outsider, an anomaly. The pirates on the island treated her with a wary mixture of suspicion and curiosity. She was the woman who had healed the king, the commoner who stood at his side. They whispered that she was a sorceress, that she held his heart in a spell. Lina ignored the whispers. She saw the toll the political battle was taking on Kaelan. The king who had been reborn in righteous fury was now being suffocated by diplomacy and doubt. She found her own way to fight. She did not speak in the council meetings. She listened. She walked through the markets, the taverns, the shipyards, places where the common crews gathered. And she told her story. Not the story of the great pirate king, but the story of a man chained in the dark. She told them of his quiet endurance, of his first rasped words, of his promise to a ghost. She didn't speak of his power, but of his humanity. Her quiet words spread faster than Serafina's grand speeches. The older crews, the ones who remembered the real Kaelan, began to nod in agreement. They saw the truth in her story. It reminded them that their king was not just a symbol of power, but a man who had suffered as they had, and had returned stronger. Loyalty, true loyalty, began to shift back, like a tide returning to its rightful shore. The final confrontation came during the Great Council, a meeting of all the pirate captains to decide their future. Serafina, confident of her victory, issued a final challenge. "We do not need a king of ghosts and vengeance," she declared to the assembly. "We need a leader who looks to the future. I propose a vote, my leadership or his. One flag to unite us all. One flag to unite us all. One flag to unite us all." Kaelan stood. The hall fell silent. He looked not at the captains, but at Lina, who stood in the shadows at the back of the hall. Her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in him, had been his anchor. He had been fighting for his past, for his vengeance, but she had shown him something new to fight for, a future. "You are right, Serafina," Kaelan said, his voice resonating through the hall, surprising everyone. "The coalition does not need a king of vengeance." He then looked at the assembled captains. "Vargas was my demon, and my demons are mine to hunt alone. I will not drag this coalition into my personal war. He then stunned the entire room. I will not stand for a vote. I will not be your king. A gasp went through the assembly. Serafina's face was a mask of triumph. However, Kaelan continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. I am still Kaelan, the dragon of the sea. And any captain who wishes to sail with me, to reclaim the honor and freedom we once fought for, is welcome on my ship. We will not be a coalition of profit. We will be a brotherhood. We will sail not for gold, but for the freedom of these seas. We sail at dawn. He turned and walked out of the council hall without a backward glance. It was the ultimate gamble. He was abandoning the throne, betting everything on personal loyalty over political power. That night, Lina found him on the cliffs overlooking the harbor, staring out at the sea. You gave up everything, she said softly. I gave up a cage, he replied, turning to face her. Serafina can have the politics and the backstabbing. I was a fool to think I could go back to that. My place is out there. He looked into her eyes, his own stormy gaze clear and certain. What I want to know is if your place is out there too, with me. He was offering her a choice, not as a king to a subject, but as a man to a woman. She could stay here, safe, wealthy, or she could choose a life of uncertainty, of storms and battles at his side. Lina looked out at the dark, endless ocean. It was terrifying. It was unknown, but for the first time in her life, it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a promise. You once told me I should not have brought you a candle in the dark, she said, a small smile on her face. You said it was dangerous. It was, he admitted. Good, she said, taking his hand. I've always enjoyed a little danger. No. As the sun rose the next morning, 2 ships sailed out of the harbor of the Isle of Whispers. One was the grand flagship of pirate Queen Serafina, the new, undisputed leader of the coalition. The other was a dark, lean vessel, the Carnage, reborn and renamed the Dawn Treader. On its deck stood a small, loyal crew, the men who had chosen a brotherhood over an empire, and at its helm stood a man who had given up a crown to reclaim his soul, and the woman who had shown him how. Their war was not over. In fact, a new one was just beginning. Sailing away from the Isle of Whispers was like waking from a long, feverish dream. The political machinations, the posturing, the weight of a crown Kaelan never truly wanted, it all faded in the saltwater spray of the open sea. He was a captain again, not a politician. His kingdom was not an island, but the horizon, and his crew, though small, was loyal to the man, not the title. Gregor, the one-eyed first mate, stood proudly at his side. The men who had followed him were the old guard, the ones who remembered the call of freedom more than the lure of gold. And then there was Lina. She was no longer the Queen of Shadows, a title born of fear and mystery. She was simply Lina, the ship's quartermaster, a role Kaelan had insisted she take. Her quiet observation and innate sense of fairness made her a natural. She managed the ship's stores with a meticulous care that shamed the pirates, and she treated every crewman with a respect they had never been shown, earning their loyalty in a way Kaelan's power never could. She and Kaelan were 2 halves of a whole, the heart and the sword of the newly christened Dawn Treader. Their first order of business was not war, it was justice. Kaelan had a promise to keep, a demon to exercise. They hunted for Vargas. It was not a long hunt. A man like Vargas, stripped of his power, leaves a trail of bitterness and betrayal. They found him cowering on a wretched little island, having been marooned by the very crew of the merchant ship he had tried to steal. The confrontation was not the epic clash Kaelan had once imagined. It was pathetic. Vargas, starved and broken, fell to his knees, begging for his life. Kaelan looked down at the man who had caused him so much pain, the man who had been the focal point of his entire existence for months, and he felt nothing. The fire of vengeance had been extinguished, quenched by something far more powerful. He looked at Lina, who stood on the beach, watching him. Her belief in him had been a greater balm than any revenge could ever be. He did not kill Vargas. He simply turned his back and walked away, leaving the man to the judgment of the island and his own hollow soul. The demon was not slain. It was rendered insignificant, and in that moment, Kaelan was finally, truly free. With his past laid to rest, a new future opened up before them. They became legends of a different sort. They were not conquerors. They were liberators. They hunted not for treasure, but for slavers' ships, freeing captives and offering them a choice, a share of the plunder and passage to a safe port, or a place in their brotherhood. Their crew grew, a patchwork of souls from every corner of the world, united not by greed, but by a shared belief in a second chance. Kaelan was the dragon of the sea again, but his fire no longer burned with rage. It burned with purpose. And through it all, his bond with Lina deepened. In the quiet hours of the night, under a blanket of stars, she continued to heal him. Her touch, which still held its faint, golden light, had erased the last of the deep cracks from his skin, leaving only a network of fine, silver lines, like a map of the man he had become. The curse was gone, but her healing went deeper than skin. She healed the parts of him that vengeance had hollowed out. He, in turn, taught her the ways of the sea. He taught her to read the stars, to feel the mood of the wind, to command a ship through a storm. He saw in her not a cleaner, not a healer, but an equal, a leader. Their love was never a thing of grand declarations. It was a thing of quiet moments. A shared glance across a busy deck. His hand finding hers on the ship's rail in the dark. The way he would always bring her the first seashell from a new shore. It was a bond forged in darkness, tested in politics, and now, finally, allowed to breathe in the clean, salt air of freedom. But the world does not let such legends live in peace for long. Queen Seraphina, her power consolidated, had grown bolder. Her coalition had become an empire, imposing its will, demanding tribute from free ports. And the Imperial Navy, seeing a single, organized pirate threat, had begun to move against her in force. The seas were becoming a chessboard for two warring empires, with no room for a single, free ship that answered to no one. The news reached them from a freed merchant captain. Seraphina was planning a final, decisive strike against the Navy's main fortress. A glorious, suicidal battle that would either make her the undisputed ruler of the seas, or see her entire fleet sunk to the bottom. That night, Kaelan and Lina stood on the prow of the Dawn Treader, the choice before them as vast as the ocean. "This is not our fight," Kaelan said, his voice heavy. "We can sail east, disappear into the unknown."
Huh?
Lina looked at him, at the man she had brought back from the brink, the king who had given up his crown. "You once told me you were a king of ghosts and vengeance," she said. "Then you became a liberator, a man who gives people a second chance. What will you be now? A man who runs?" She placed her hand over his heart. "Your curse is gone, Kaelan. But the man you are, the man I fell in love with, would he stand by and watch the seas burn just to save himself?" He looked into her eyes, and he saw his own soul reflected there, stronger and brighter than he had ever known it to be. He had run from his past once. He would not run from his future. The final scene is not of a battle, but of a decision. The Dawn Treader, its sails catching the morning sun, is not sailing east, away from the conflict. It is turning its prow back towards the heart of the storm. Not to reclaim a throne, not for vengeance, but to fight for the one thing that had become more valuable than any treasure, freedom. Kaelan stands at the helm, his hand on the wheel. Lina stands beside him, her hand resting over his. They are not a king and his queen. They are two captains, guiding their ship and their destiny together. The camera pulls back, showing the small, determined ship sailing towards an uncertain horizon, a single point of light and hope against a gathering storm. Their story was not over. It had just found its true north.